Dear viewers, a few days ago I came across this map, and even though we all know that the followers of Jewish religion inhabited the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in large numbers, the scale of this phenomenon presented on this map is striking. I started my own research to the topic, and it turns out that almost half of the world's Jews lived in this area. It surprised me, so I started to delve deeper into the topic, and it quickly turned out that this map did not show the situation from 1900, but from 1880, 20 years earlier. Why? I will explain you this matter later. I will also explain how did it happen that such a large number of Jews appeared in United States of America in the beginning of 20th century. But first of all, I will try to explain why it happened that the eastern part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a global oasis for the followers of Judaism. After all, this is not their homeland, so did they move there in large numbers? If so, why they did so? Or maybe people in this area converted willingly to Judaism. Is it somehow connected with the Turkish Khazars Khaganate, who adopted Judaism as their own religion in 8th century? Or maybe there are other reasons. Stay with me, because now I will reveal you what I found in my research. The world has never been very kind to Jews, who lived in rather closed groups, clearly different in lifestyle and beliefs from surrounding communities. Already in ancient times, after the failure of Simon Bar Kokhba uprising in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian forbid them to settle in Jerusalem, and many of them were deported to the distant parts of the empire. Later, things were no better, because Theodosius and after him Justinian the Great introduced anti-Semitic laws. For example, the testimony of people of Jewish faith could not be taken into account in courts if the cause was against a Christian. What's more, the situation changed dramatically for the wars in the 7th century. First, in 614, the Sassanids captured Jerusalem, and the Jews cooperated with them in this conquest. After taking the walls, they began to send Christians, most of whom lived peacefully in this Byzantine city, to heaven. When Emperor Heraclius regained Jerusalem several years later, he issued a decree against the Jews, remembering their cooperation with the Sassanids. He simply considered them as enemies of the state. Then it got even worse. Anti-Jewish attitudes were incredibly strong in early Islam. Muhammad himself in Medina was a precursor of persecution against Jewish inhabitants. Therefore, with the expansion of the first Muslim Caliphate and the occupation of Egypt, Judea, Syria, and Mesopotamia in the mid-7th century, Jewish refugees fled farther and farther from the Middle East. The repression by the Muslims were compounded by further repressions by the Byzantine emperors. At the turn of 7th and 8th centuries, Justinian II forbid followers of Judaism to hold public offices and ordered forced conversions to Christianity. Later, these actions were continued by Leo the Isaurian, who bloodily tried to unify the empire around one religion, Orthodox Christianity. In a situation where almost all the areas previously inhabited by the Jews came under a rule of rulers who were definitely hostile to them, by the 8th century their exodus was very large. Where did they go then? In fact, there were two directions of escape. First, to Spain, called Al-Andalus by the Arabs, where power was taken over in the mid-8th century by Abd al-Rahman I of Umayyad family, who was hostile to the new dynasty ruling in the Caliphate, the Abbasids. And secondly, to the Great Steppe, north of the Caucasus Mountains, where the Turkic Khazar people ruled a huge state focused on long-distance trade and very religiously tolerant. It was a real paradise for the followers of Judaism. The scale of migration to the Khazar Khaganate was so large that from the mid-8th century most of the Khazar Khans and aristocracy also converted to Judaism. This was not only due to the fact that there was a large influx of people from the south following Judaism and that they felt like a fish in the water when it came to trade. Moreover, Tangrism, the ethnic religion of Turkish Khazars, was not culturally strong enough to effectively compare with the rabbis. In addition, the Khazars saw the clash of two powers in the south, Byzantine Christianity and Arab Islam. They didn't want to take part in this war, they preferred to make money from it. The level of Judaization of this country is best demonstrated by the fact that since the mid-9th century, Turkish names have been disappeared among the Khagans and the following ones prevail: Zachary, Benjamin, Aaron, David, Joseph. Today, it's impossible to determine what percentage of the people of the Khazar Khaganate were followers of Judaism, nor how many of them were Jews in the genetic sense and how many converted to Judaism. The scale of conversion to the Abrahamic religion was certainly significant, and if the ruling class adopted it largely, so did many of their subjects. I think that about quarter of the population of the Khazar Khaganate was of Jewish faith. After all, it was the largest country in history with Judaism as the main religion. In the 10th century, the great Russian prince Oleg conquered the Khazar Khaganate and destroyed the most important trade centers as Sarkal and their capital on the Volga River, Itil. However, the Khazar Jews did not disappear. They moved to Russia and continued to conduct their businesses there in the most important centers of the great state, in Novgorod, Pskov, and Kiev. Few decades later, even great Prince Vladimir was considering conversion to Judaism, but finally he chose Orthodox Christianity, and his decision from 988 changed the history of this part of Europe for centuries. But still, in 12th century, Jewish merchants were very active in Kiev, profiting from trade and granting loans. However, Russians borrowing money were very unhappy when they had to repay these loans. so they began to complain to Vladimir Monomach, the Grand Prince of Kiev. He accepted the complaints of his subjects and expelled the Jews from Kiev. Then they fled to other Russian cities because it was the time of the division of Russia and the power of Vladimir Monomach was geographically quite limited. Let us now look at the situation of the Jews in their second oasis of peace, in Muslim Spain. In the 10th century, when the Caliphate of Cordoba was at the height of its power, the Jews in Spain lived very well. There was extraordinary religious tolerance both for them and for Christians. They could freely engage in trade, art, science, and medicine. There were many high officials in the Caliph's power structure who followed Judaism. There also were many poets and scientists among them. The only thing Jews had to do was to pay jizya, a special tax for non-Muslim inhabitants. However, the situation changed very much to the disadvantage from the 11th century, when the Iberian Peninsula from the north was increasingly occupied by the kings of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, full of Christian zeal, and from the south came fanatically zealous Muslims from Morocco, from the Almoravid and later Almohad dynasties. In the medieval clash between Islam and Christianity on the Iberian Peninsula, the followers of Judaism suffered blows from both warring sides. Finally, when Granada fell and the Reconquista ended in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, immediately after entering the city, issued a famous Edict of the Alhambra, which ordered all Jews to leave Spain within 4 months. At that time, they numbered about 10% of all inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula, approximately 700,000 people. Considering medieval relations, a colossal migration took place in a very short time. Moreover, the King of Portugal copied the Alhambra Edict a few years later, so thousands of refugees who had first sought refuge there had to board ships again and sail to Ottoman Empire and Poland. However, it wasn't the first such an act in Europe, but it was definitely the most important because no other country in the Middle Ages, apart from Khazaria, had such a large Jewish community. The Jews scattered around the world. Some fled to the Ottoman Empire, where there was a fair amount of religious tolerance, some to Italy, and some to distant Poland, which had a culture of religious tolerance unusual for these times. The Statute of Kalisz, issued on August 16, 1264, by Prince Bolesław the Pious, was respected by subsequent Polish rulers and became the basic regulation of the legal situation of Jews in Poland. This document provided penalties for desecrating cemeteries and synagogues, regulated the rules of conducting commercial and credit activities, and freed Jews from the power of city officials, subordinating them directly to the judgment of the monarch or voivode. Additionally, the Statute of Kalisz guaranteed them freedom of travel and trade. This set of pooling factors in form of legal stability and security was extraordinary in Europe at that time and made Poland and later also Lithuania a refuge for followers of Judaism. Already in the heat of Christian zeal during the First Crusade in 1096 to 1098, almost all Jews were expelled from Bohemia, most of whom fled to Poland. Later, even greater exodus was caused by an edict from Edward I, King of England. Previously, both he and his subjects had greatly benefited from loans granted by the Jewish merchants. However, as we know, no one likes to repay loans. So in 1290, Edward came up with the same brilliant idea as Vladimir Monomach in Russia and decided to expel all Jews from England and confiscate their property and of course cancel all loans. This law existed in England until 17th century. They fled from England to France, but they did not stay there for long because 16 years later, in 1306, Philip the Fair, needing to finance his war in Flanders, decided to exile the Jews from France and to confiscate their property. This ruler had truly barbaric ideas for repairing his budget. A few years later, when he was short of money again, he found another target, the Templars, and he also brought them down. After the Black Death epidemic in the middle of 14th century, many thinkers of that time decided to accuse you know who of bringing this catastrophe. There were large expulsions from Germany and also from Hungary. And now you can easily understand that at the same time Casimir the Great creates a thriving Jewish town near the walls of his capital city, Krakow. Because in the 14th century, knowing what happened in France and England, the vast majority of Jews fled to Poland. The daughter of Jewish refugee from Bohemia, Esther, was said to be so beautiful that the great king of Poland could not resist her charms. Casimir, the last of the Piast dynasty on the Polish throne, had only daughters in his right woodlock, and he even had 2 sons with this Jewish lover. Many people assume that it is thanks to the charms of Esther, Jews in Poland received so many privileges from the king. Another large influx of Jews to Poland and Lithuania took place in 1495 when the Grand Master of the Sword Brothers in Livonia, Gotthard von Plattenberg, dissatisfied with the competition that Jews were giving to German merchants in Riga and other commercial ports on the eastern banks of Baltic Sea, expelled them from his country. So I traced the most important exiles of the Abrahamic people in the medieval Europe, and now let's take a closer look at what land these people ended up in. In addition to the Kalisz Statute of 1264, Casimir the Great also issued laws 3 times, aiming at regulating the position of Jews in Poland, giving them a special position. But he also limited interest loan granted by the Jews. The highest possible loan was 104% yearly in the Western Poland and 52% in Eastern Poland. The 16th century came. The Protestant movements were born in Western Europe. Religious war began to break out with great intensity, and anti-Semitism was strong in this climate of intolerance. While in Poland in 1573 the Warsaw Confederation Act was issued, which guaranteed everyone complete freedom of beliefs, a solution completely unheard of in Europe at this time. But this act did not come out of vacuum. It was consequence of long tradition of religious tolerance in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, both for the Orthodox, for the Muslim Tatars, for Armenians living there, and also for the Jews. And if that were not enough, 7 years later, Stefan Batory, King of Poland, also established the Parliament of Four Lands, a democratic body similar to the main Polish parliament, but exclusively for Jews, bringing together four lands mainly inhabited by them. So not only did they have religious tolerance unparalleled anywhere else in Europe, but they also had a great deal of self-government. And now you can understand how it came that Jewish society in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth thrived in the 17th, 18th century. And now we can come back to the map I showed you in the beginning. It turned out during my investigation that it's a modification of original German map from 1880. Now you can see the original map. After centuries of persecution in other European countries and centuries of tolerance in Poland and Lithuania, in the 19th century, half of all Jews in the world lived in the lands of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But this old Polish-Lithuanian tolerance was not longer there when the structures of this state were destroyed in late 18th century by Russians and Germans. And Tsarina Katarina II immediately after grabbing the eastern lands of Poland and Lithuania introduced the so-called settlement zone, a designated area where Jews can live and beyond which they cannot go. She was afraid that the rest of her country would undergo Judaization, and therefore she created great Eastern European ghetto for the Jewish population. In addition, in 1827, Tsar Nicholas further tightened the screws on the Jews, increasing the number of conscripts taken from each Jewish community, and finally, on March 13, 1881, in St. Petersburg, the revolutionary organization Narodnaya Wola carried out a bomb attack on Tsar Alexander II. The attack ended tragically for the Tsar, and one of the organizers was a Jewish woman, Hesia Halfman. This became an excuse to blame the entire attack on the Jews, against whom the May Law were issued a year later, prohibiting them from creating new houses in villages and small towns, even inside the previously designed settlement zone. Moreover, there were many prosecutions and repressions organized both by the authorities and from the people. Therefore, about half of the Jews living there decided to escape. And their main destination was United States of America. In the late 19th century, it was real land of freedom, especially in comparison oppressive Russian Tsardom. So about 2 million Jews shipped to USA in few decades after 1881 and increased the Jewish population in America from 300,000 in 1880 to about 3 million in the beginning of First World War. This is how I managed to solve the mystery of this great concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe. Finally, one more question. How many of them were from the east, from the former Khazar Khaganate, and how many were from the west? This would require in-depth genetic, linguistic, and cultural analysis, which are not the subject of this lecture. But I will only put forward a hypothesis that at least 1/3 of the Jews living in the 19th century in the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were of Khazar origin. Although a significant part of them traveled a long way to get there because first, after the fall of Khazar Khaganate, they emigrated to Hungary and Germany, where over the following centuries the Yiddish language was created, a mixture of German, Hebrew, and Slavic languages. And it was only under the influence of repressions and expulsions later in Germany that these Jews found refuge in Poland and Lithuania. Thank you for your attention. It was Ziemowit about history.